Welcome back to another episode of Opal Wave MTG, a channel dedicated to exploring power levels in EDH and helping you tune your deck to your meta. I'm your host Jacob, and today we're going to be looking at Braids Arisen Nightmare, which is a 3-mana 3/3 nightmare with, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. And from my playtesting of this card, you can draw a lot of cards with this commander. It's actually really surprising just how strong of a card advantage engine it is. So the deck lists are in the description below as usual, and if you want to help support my channel, check out my Fiverr. That'll be in the description below as well. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So for the Skirmish version of Braids, I really wanted to go with pretty straightforward kind of a build. Play some creatures, sacrifice the creatures, maybe sacrifice a few other permanent types as well, and you just have the creatures that you sacrifice be able to return to the battlefield. So starting off, we've got 2 planeswalkers here. Tavesh can create tokens for us so we can sacrifice the Braids or just generate even more card advantage for us. We can sacrifice planeswalkers, so if we want to sacrifice a planeswalker, so our opponents, while our opponents don't have a planeswalker out, we'll be able to, guarantee that we draw 3 extra cards. Moving on to our creatures, like I said, we've got stuff like Blood-Soaked Champion, Cult Conscript, Clattering Augur, Gutterbones, a lot of creatures that we can sacrifice, and then they also have the ability to resurrect when they do. We also have a good bit of creatures that can ping our opponents, stuff like Ayara, as well as Falkenrath Noble, and let's see here, I know there's another one, Zulaport Cutthroat. Those kind of cards that can just let us do the death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing, where we can keep sacrificing, draw more cards, get more advantage that way, and slowly ping our opponents to death. We've also got a Psychosis Crawler, so if we do end up drawing a lot of cards, this can potentially just kill the table, be really great. I've also added a Body Launderer. This card seems pretty sweet. As we continue to sacrifice our creatures, this guy is going to get bigger, and then we can eventually sacrifice him to Braids to bring something back to the battlefield. Junji can also do that if we really want to. We've also got a Woe Strider as an additional sacrifice outlet, and some stuff like Filigree Familiar, Solemn Simulacrum, and Junk Diver that can just give us a little bit of extra utility when we sacrifice them. Moving on to the sorceries, Blood Money and In Garruk's Wake there's essentially just board wipes. It's good if we're trying to sacrifice creatures and we really want to draw the cards. Keeping the boards clear of creatures is going to be a really great way of guaranteeing that we are drawing those cards. We've also got to Feed the Swarm just to deal with enchantments in case we try to sacrifice one of ours to get someone else to and they don't want to. They do get that choice, so can have a little bit of backfire, so having Feed the Swarm to get rid of those is going to be really nice. Inscription of Ruin can return something to our battlefield with CMC 2 or less, which is pretty sweet, especially if we sacrificed it. We can also have a player discard 2 cards if we want to, or it can be removal. So Yawgmoth's Vile Offering can also be really great in reanimating a planeswalker or a creature, in addition to being removal. So for 5 mana, not bad. In our instance, we've just got a few ways, like the Abnormal Endurance and the Supernatural Stamina. So we can use this to protect our Braids if we really want to, but we can also have it target a creature, and at our end step we can sacrifice the creature that we used one of these cards on, and then we will get it back. So if you want like an extra ETB ability or something like that, these can be really great ways to double up on that. We've also added the new Cut Down. This is actually a really decent removal spell, especially for those annoying creatures that are like stacks pieces or whatever, hate bears and whatnot. Bake into a Pie as another removal spell that can also give us a food we can sacrifice to make, attempt to make players sacrifice artifacts, and just some more pretty straightforward destroy target creature type of stuff. Moving on to our artifacts, we've got some pretty cool options here actually. Ichor Wellspring. So when it enters, you're going to draw a card. When it leaves a battle, you can draw a card. So you can draw a lot of cards off of this one artifact potentially, because you can sack it with the Braids to immediately draw one, and then if no one else is sacrificing artifacts, you get to draw an extra 3 cards. So for 1 card, you can potentially draw 5 cards, which is a lot. Trading Post, which can help us, get back some of our artifacts or potentially some of the creatures that we are sacrificing. Pretty decent option here. And just a few 2-3 drop rocks. Nothing too crazy here. Nihil Spellbomb, a really nice option. Get rid of players' graveyards, but we can also just pay the black and draw an extra card when we sacrifice it to Braids if we don't need to remove graveyards. So really nice option. And then a Mycosynth Wellspring, which is kind of like the Ichor Wellspring, but this is going to give us lands when it enters the battlefield or put into a graveyard. So a decent way to guarantee land drops and just be some nice sacrifice fodder for Braids. Moving on to the enchantments, we've got two really spicy includes that I want to mention here: Demonic Lore and Treacherous Blessing. So both of these cards, when they enter the battlefield, you get to draw 3 cards. And then they have downsides. So with Treacherous Blessing, whenever you cast a spell, you lose a life. And with Demonic Lore, at the beginning of your end step, you lose 2 life for each card in your hand. So essentially, you'll cast this card and you'll get to draw 3 cards, but then you can sacrifice it to Braids so you don't have to deal with the downside of the card. So unfortunately with Demonic Lore, you will still have to lose life because the trigger is going to go on the stack at the same time as Braids. So I recommend resolving the Demonic Lore trigger first. That way you lose less life than if you were to resolve the Braids trigger first. Because if you resolve Braids first, you're gonna have more cards in your hand, so you'll take more damage or lose more life. So resolve the Demonic Lore first in this situation. But I thought it'd be pretty cool. I mean, essentially in this deck, you're paying 3 mana to draw like 3+ cards, possibly up to 6, which is pretty decent. And then you can just sacrifice it, not have to deal with the downsides. Tortured Existence, get back some of the creatures that we are sacrificing, especially with something like the Cloud Iron Augur, where we can pay 4 mana and return it back to our hand, so it can be pretty nice fodder for the Tortured Existence. And Vampiric Rites is another way for us to get back our creatures, and a Palace Siege. And then the Bastion of Remembrance and a Blight Mound will let us get back creatures. Not get back creatures, give us some value when we are sacrificing our creatures. So in the lands, we've got a few utility stuff like Blast Zone. Drownyard Temple is a really cool include here, since you can sacrifice it to Braids, and people aren't really going to want to sacrifice the land, so it's pretty much guaranteed that you're going to draw 3 cards. But you can pay 3 and return it to the battlefield from your graveyard by paying 3, so a really cool option in that respect. We've also got the Dakmor Salvage, which is kind of in the same vein, where you can sacrifice the Braids, and then with one of your Braids triggers, if you're drawing cards, you can actually dredge this back into your hand. So just a way to kind of guarantee that you're not losing out on land drops essentially when you are sacking the lands. Stuff like Myriad Landscape to help us ramp, and Barren more, so we can potentially cycle, get some extra utility out of our lands. Witch's Cottage can get creatures back if we have enough swamps in play. Cabal Stronghold is a pretty decent option here. And the Takunuma, since it's essentially free real estate. And moving on to the battle version of Braids, we've upgraded one of our planeswalkers with the Liliana Dreadhorde General, so we can draw even more cards when our creatures die. Still got the Devesh, I think is a pretty decent option here. We've upgraded our win cons for sure. We've added a Grey Merchant of Asphodel. We've got a Shielder to put more pressure on the boards. And then with cards like the Reassembling Skeleton, we've added a combo essentially. So with cards like the Pitiless Plunderer and like a Pawn of Ulamog out, if you have a sacrifice outlet like the Viscera Seer, you can sacrifice your Reassembling Skeleton. You make a a dude, an Eldrazi, as well as a treasure. You can use the mana from these two to activate the reassembling skeleton's ability and put it back into the battlefield. And then if you have something like an Ayara or a Sir Conrad, you can drain your opponents out and kill them. Indrixar, since we do have a few sacrifice outlets, he could be a cool way for us to get a bunch of creatures that we can then sacrifice with our Braids ability, or just use them to generate more mana, stuff like the Pitiless Plunder. We've also got like a Kokusho, which can help us kill the boards, a Jadar, so we can continually make creatures with Decayed, and yeah, so definitely just increased our some of our win cons, and we've added a combo, and with a little bit of redundancy, just to up the power just a little bit. So moving on to our sorceries, we've got Damnation to help clear the board, definitely reducing the costs here. Demonic Tutor and Grim Tutor for tutoring, a Reanimate, so we can bring back some of our more important pieces back to the board. A Thoughtseize to kind of deal with hands, and a Torment of Hailfire when the games are going on for a while, and then a great way to close out games. In the instance, we've added a Dark Ritual for those turn 1 Braids, where we can generate a lot of card advantage really fast, and we've reduced the cost of our removal spells, made them a little bit more efficient, kept the cut down, just because we gotta keep the new cards in here as well. Drag to the Underworld is a really interesting option, since most of the time, if you have Braids out, this is just going to cost 2 mana, so pretty decent removal option here. And moving on to the artifacts, again, we're reducing costs. We've added stuff like Liquid Metal Torque and an expedition, or sorry, not expedition map, but Wayfarer's Bauble. We've kept the Ichor Wellspring, just because it's going to be a really great way for us to draw cards. And we've also added a Gerard's Hourglass Pendant. Really interesting option for our opponent's going to start an extra turn. They'll have to skip that turn instead, but the really cool option here is if we have a full board, we can use this to protect our board essentially. Someone destroys all the creatures, or someone Armageddon's or something, we can float a bunch of mana, cast our Gerard's Hourglass, and then immediately activate it to bring back all the stuff that we just lost. So a really cool option here. Moving on to our enchantments, we've still got the Demonic Lore and the Treacherous Blessing. I think these cards are just super sweet in this deck. Added some Dictate type effects, some Grave Pack type stuff, so when we sacrifice a creature, they'll have to sacrifice a creature no matter what, and it'll put more pressure on those boards. Oath of Liliana, another really interesting option, since when it enters the battlefield, each opponent has to sack a creature, but then you can sacrifice the enchantment, just in case they have like enough creatures, and they can sacrifice the creatures instead of wanting to sacrifice an enchantment to kind of guarantee the card draw here. Attrition is going to be a really nice option, especially with something like the Jadar or the Indrixar, where we can really control the boards with an attrition, be really sweet. And a Meat Hork Massacre, just another board wipe that can also serve as a win condition. Moving on to our lands, we've added the Plaza of Heroes. It's going to be a really cool card in this deck. Added stuff like Nykthos and Cabal Coffers to up our mana production. Yeah, so those are pretty much the big includes, moving from the Skirmish to the battle version. Before moving on to the glory version of Braids, if you like what I'm doing and you think this content's cool, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know what you did with your version of Braids and what commander you'd like to see me brew next. And moving on to the glory version of Braids, which is our cEDH version. And this deck turned out to be super spicy, so I wanted to avoid doing like a Turbo Nas kind of strategy, so instead I went with a hard stacks deck. So yeah, let's jump right into it. We've got Karn the Great Creator to shut off our opponent's artifacts. We've got a Professor Onyx with that Magecraft ability, so we can do the Chain of Smog combos. And if you're not familiar how that goes, basically you target yourself, and then you can copy it and then you can just keep copying it because you keep targeting yourself. And with the Magecraft, each time you copy a spell, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So it's a little risky since you're not going to have cards in your hand anymore, but depending on the situation, or maybe if you sacrifice a Hope of Gearper, you can stop certain players from interacting with you when you are performing this combo. So pretty decent way for us to end the game. Then we've also got the Tavesh. Still, I think this card, it's just really great. If you can get this card out really quickly, it'll do a lot of work in tables in terms of blocking and sacrifices and stuff like that. Cabal Therapist, another really interesting option to help control hands. We've added some of our staples like Dothy Voidwalker and the Opposition Agent. We've also added a Kalitas to really help control our opponent's graveyards, kind of shut down like Hulk type strategies. Some really interesting options. We've got the Maryland plus Opposition Agent. So your opponents can't draw cards, and at the beginning of each player's draw step, they lose 3 life and search their library instead of drawing a card. So if we have an Opposition Agent out, we will essentially draw, or not draw, but we get to essentially tutor up a card from each of our opponent's decks every turn, and since they can't draw cards, we will essentially lock out the game. So if they don't have any kind of removal in their hand when you do assemble this lock, you pretty much win the game, because then you can just search your opponent's decks and just assemble their combos essentially. Plague Engineer, this card is actually really spicy in terms of cEDH. So you can name elves if you really want to, and then from that point all the mana dorks that people are running will have to die. Another really great option for this is to name warriors. So if you're playing against an Agila deck, the Nagila is not going to make any, Nagila will make warriors, but then they're just going to die immediately. So a really interesting option to kind of control either some of the, like I was saying, like the warrior decks or the elf decks if you see a lot of small ramp type creatures. So yeah, I don't really see this run around too much in cEDH, but I think this actually has a lot of potential in that context. So then we've got the Jadar, Gold Collar of Nephalia still, as well as an Ophiomancer. In addition to being like sacrifice outlets for Braids, there are some really interesting locks we can do in addition to into that. So we've added a contamination. So whenever a land is tapped for mana, it produces black instead of its normal type and amount. And then we can, in order to keep this in the battlefield, we have to sacrifice a creature or sacrifice contamination. So we have stuff like Bitter Blossom, Black Market Connection, Dreadhorde Invasion, as well as the Jadar and the Ophiomancer to maintain that. So if we've got like a Karn plus the contamination where we're shutting off our opponent's artifacts, shutting off their lands unless they're mono black, and we can potentially shut off their mana dorks if they're on if they're on the creature ramp. So this, if you've ever heard of the Holy Trinity, it's a Morath deck. Highly recommend checking it out. But we can kind of create a Holy Trinity if it were basically shutting off all of our opponent's forms of ramp. So a really interesting option we've got here. And then we've also got the Yawgmoth that can pair really nicely with some of our token producers to help control the board as well. Moving on to our sorceries, we've added a few more tutors, like the Diabolic Intent and the Imperial Seal, Toxic Deluge to help control the board. Collective Brutality is really great for controlling the board as well. Since we can draw a ton of cards off Braid, escalating it won't be that hard. Praetor's Grasp, to tutor for some of our opponent's win cons, or whatever the situation needs. Still got that Chain of Smog to combo with the Liliana, and a Dark Deal to kind of reset hands potentially. The main reason I've added this is for the Maryland. So if we have Maryland out plus the Dark Deal, we can essentially just strip everyone's hands, and then we can get the Opposition Agent out too. So essentially, if you have both of these in your hand, at the beginning of the next end step, you'll cast your Opposition Agent. Then during your turn, you cast Maryland into Dark Deal, and then no one has cards in their hands anymore, so it's almost guaranteed that they can't stop the Maryland. And then you also have your opposition agent, and from there, it's basically impossible for your opponents to stop you once you've ripped everyone's hands apart, and then you just get to search everyone's libraries for the rest of the game. So moving on to our instance, we've added a few more rituals, stuff like Cabal Ritual, Calling the Weak, any Dark Ritual, as well as just making our removal that much more efficient. Still keeping the cut down. This card's just really good. So yeah, it's fantastic. Still got stuff like Fatal Push, Grasp of Darkness, Deadly Brolic, Ulcerate, just really strong, efficient removal spells here. And moving on to our artifacts, we've definitely added a lot of artifacts, added our fast mana, stuff like the Chrome Mox, Mox Opal, Mox Diamond, all that good stuff, and we've added a bunch of stacks pieces, so stuff like Grafdigger's Cage, Chalice of the Void. We've also got Torpor Orb to shut off ETB effects, Weathered Runestone is much like the Grafdigger's Cage, Sorcerer's Spyglass, where we can turn off specific commanders if we really need to. We've also got a Curse Totem, since we don't have a lot of activated abilities in our deck. This will be really great. I think the only one we really have is like Kalitas, but that's not really that big of a deal losing that. Blood Pet, not a big deal, and the Yawgmoth, which is kind of a bummer, but at the same time this is going to hurt your opponents way more than it hurts us, so we definitely want to keep this in the deck. And a Dampening Sphere with the Trinosphere to slow the storm type decks from going off. Then we've also got a Tangle Wire, which is really good at slowing down the board. And another really cool thing about these is that if you've got like the Sorcerer's Spyglass and then the thing that you named is eventually removed, you can sacrifice it to Braids to get the extra draw. So as well as the Tangle Wire, once you've got the Tangle Wire down to 1, where it's really not going to matter, or even down to 0, because with Fading, you can, once you remove the last counter, it's at 0, and then you just wait the next turn to get rid of it. Instead, you can just sacrifice it to Braids and get that extra value out of it. So really cool way to utilize Braids in terms of that. We've also got the Bolus's Top interaction to help us rip through our decks. So yeah, it's a little anti-synergy with like the Dampening Sphere and the Trinosphere, but it's still strong enough that I figured we would include it anyway. And moving on to our enchantments, like I said, we've got the Bitter Blossom, the Dreadhorde Invasion, and the Black Market Connections to help keep up with the contamination. We've also added an Engineered Plague. It's essentially the Plague Engineer, but an enchantment. Again, I think these cards are kind of slept on actually in terms of cEDH. Again, hitting those elves or warriors, or even if there's like some 2-drop humans that you really need to name, you can have both of these name human, and then all the humans get -2/-2. It's gonna be really hard for a one-noted deck to operate under that effect. In Oppression, since we can generate a ton of card advantage, we can play through this really easily, and a Necropotence, just because it's a fantastic draw option. So, in our lands, made a bunch of upgrades, added more utility in terms of removal in our lands, stuff like the Ifnir Dreadlands, Cabal Pit. We've added the Gemstone Caverns for the more of an explosive start, Phyrexian Tower for that extra mana, Ancient Tomb, again, stronger, faster starts. We've also added a Homeward Path in case someone takes our Braids. We can gain that control of that again, and an Urza's Saga so we can tutor out some of our faster mana. Again, we got that Plaza of Heroes. It's just for real estate. It's really not that bad in this deck. We don't really lose out too much if we need to drop this on turn 1, since we have a lot of 0 or artifact type stuff in our deck. So thanks for checking out this episode of Opal Wave MTG. Again, I'm your host Jacob, and until next time.